Hey, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us at the Small Business Briefing. It is Monday, October 18th. I'm Rob Fowler with the Small Business Association of Michigan and joined by Brian Calley, president of SBAM. Brian, it's Data Monday. We'll get into that in just a second. We're both back in Lansing. Last time we talked on Thursday, we were up on Mackinac Island, and it was our board and leadership council meeting. Always great to be in a room full of small business owners, and I think we got some real insight.
We really did. One of the things that we've switched to over the last few years is to have more of the programming actually delivered by the small business owners themselves. It's peer-to-peer learning, and it's such a dynamic room when you put entrepreneurs together. And you could not have asked for anything better on Mackinac Island. You can see behind me in Lansing, it's a beautiful day, but it looked just like that on Mackinac Island. To have that type of an opportunity in October in the Straits of Mackinac is really something. So all the way around, great day.
Yeah, it sure was. All right, let's dig into the data. We've taken to calling this Data Monday. It gives us a chance at least once a week to look at the data that is continuing to drive decision making on this pandemic. And while it seems like there's maybe some crosswinds a little bit in the data as we look at it this time.
Yeah, so we'll take a look at our numbers, and we'll go through it pretty quickly because it's pretty similar to what we saw last week, and in fact the week before. Here's just a look at county by county for the entire country. You'll see that these southern states that were pretty red before now have cooled off quite a bit, driving the entire nation's numbers down. You see out here in the northern west and the Midwest here, numbers a little bit redder now. So our national numbers, they continue to come down, again driven by those bigger states that were up and now coming back down. So good trends here for the country as a whole. Same with hospitalizations. This looks just like the overall infection curve, and then fatalities, deaths are always a little bit behind, but trending in the same direction. So Michigan's cases, you'll see still going up though. Generally, a straight line in terms of its trajectory has looked very similar since the beginning of July, or about halfway through July when they started moving up, but not as sharply as other places. Take a look though at the last 7 days, or the last 90 days, I'm sorry, for the 7-day average, you'll see that it is looks like it is starting to level off now. So hopefully a good sign there. And then hospitalizations on the rise, but not anywhere near as much as before. And fatalities in the state also have been on the rise, but not as much as before. And when you take a look at a state we haven't looked at before, this is Minnesota. It looks pretty similar on its rise as Michigan. And their numbers went kind of down falsely during Labor Day and then back up. So it seems pretty similar to what Michigan is, except for if you look at this one in the last 90 days, you'll see it really does look like it's peaked and is starting to come down. So maybe a precursor for a curve that looks just like Michigan's. This one looks like it's finally crested and started to come down. Maybe Michigan's will follow suit in the next couple of weeks. Their hospitalizations and their deaths look about the same as Michigan during this particular wave. And then check in with United Kingdom like I always do, because this one is where we've seen consistently moderately high infection numbers, but very low deaths, and that is holding true now for several months. So we are, I think, in terms of the UK, they really do look like they've entered into a new phase, and so it's a phase that we could all maybe aspire to reach. But I was looking all around the country over the weekend, just trying to find somebody that looked like Michigan in terms of this particular wave and what might happen. And I think that Minnesota matches up the best. And so maybe as they look like in the last 3 weeks or so, they crested and started to come down. we'll look out for Michigan the next few days and see if that happens here too.
Hey, Brian, to your point, just before we started this briefing, the new numbers came out. 2,800 per day average over the weekend, which is way down from that peak you just showed. So I think you're right that would tend to follow the Minnesota example, that those would be numbers certainly down pretty sharply from the 7-day average going into it.
Yeah, one thing that it's always, in Michigan, we treasure these kinds of days during fall. And so, sometimes what'll happen is it's a beautiful day. I'm not going to go get a test. I'm not going to stand in line and get a test. So some of that type of weather behavior effect might impact those, because it's unseasonably nice out these days. But great news anytime you see the numbers start to fall, especially since our hospitalizations really were still going up at the same trajectory. So we know that from our discussion last week, that hospitalization for non-COVID reasons that have kind of stacked up over the last year and a half have really made management at hospitals pretty dicey for inpatients. So they really can't afford to have the COVID numbers go up much higher. But great news. I actually hadn't seen today's numbers come out yet. So if they're down to an average of 2,800 per day, that's a very significant difference.
Well, obviously part of the reason we watch these data is it gives us a sense of what might be coming. We're at about 68% vaccinated for 16 and older population in Michigan. The 70%, the magic 70% number is within reach, and really, if you include those who've gotten the natural immunity or haven't gotten the disease, we may be near the end of that, and we've seen some articles about that and some speculation about that. So it sort of begs the question: what's the public policy response? And it's the thing we're continuing to look at. President Biden said that he's asking his Labor Department, and specifically the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to come up some rules that effectively would require vaccines for companies over 100 or those who do business with the government. What is the status of that as we know it?
Last week, OSHA sent to the White House, and more specifically the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at the White House, sent a draft set of rules for this private sector mandate. So it has not been made public. We don't know what's in it. And we don't have any idea whether or not the White House is going to review it and say, go forth, or if they're going to say, make changes. So we're kind of on the lookout now. We feel like at any point, the White House, if they bless the publication of these rules, what would happen is they get filed, and there's a 6-month period of time where these can be in place as emergency rules. They call it an emergency temporary standard that can last for up to 6 months. So as soon as that happens, we'll share with you what it says. Now, many of our members aren't going to fall under at least how they described it in the beginning, but we do have plenty of members that are in the healthcare space, and also members that are federal contractors, and then some that have over 100 employees. So we'll have some. So many people watching might not be impacted directly by the mandate, but nevertheless, whatever it is, we will bring it forth so you can take a look at the details. Now, I in terms of what to expect, I mean, I know that they're feeling the pressure to put something out, so they're going to. I wouldn't be surprised if they took this draft and made very minor changes with the idea of expediency over getting it perfect. So we really, I mean, this is something I'm watching very closely, daily, several times a day. If they put this out, any indication of this is going to be a month-long review or a 3-day long review, we just don't have a sense for that yet. So now there is another emergency temporary standard for healthcare that went into place in June. That one will be up in December, and so this will be interesting on the healthcare side of things. whether or not they just make it permanent with no changes, or they try to make it permanent with no changes. But on the private sector side, I think that we're really entering into a time of pretty heavy litigation. As soon as this gets filed, and the emergency temporary standard goes into place, then you're going to see quite a bit of litigation around this. And I think that the Sixth Circuit, which Michigan is in, is going to be an area where you're going to see a lot of activity, a lot of action, because of the makeup of the judges in that district. So you'll see some state attorney generals getting involved, and then you'll see others where, I mean, basically it's just a good bet where you have a Republican attorney general. Probably they're going to enjoin to challenge the emergency temporary standard. And then third parties in states where they don't have Republican attorney general, and then it's probably going to fall. No, probably it will fall down along partisan lines on this sort of thing. An attorney general from the same party will never challenge a president of the same party. It just doesn't work that way. But you'll see probably lawsuits in every state. We talked a little bit about Texas banning vaccine mandates as an executive order, and I think that really does put them in kind of a leadership position in challenging this rule that appears to be forthcoming sometime soon.
Yeah, and again, we can watch the data. Let me give you 3 headlines that will kind of argue for and against a vaccine mandate, or at least put wind in the sails of those who want to argue for or against. COVID-related police officer deaths are up. College campus outbreaks are down. And kids, according to research, are as safe or safer than vaccinated adults.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting set of data coming out in a lot of different areas. So it begs a question. So when the feds put this out, they can't just put it out with no justification. They'll have to prove it. It's going to go into court. And so the first question would be, what are they basing their authority on? What they're going to likely say is that employers have a general duty obligation to provide a work environment free from recognized hazards, and COVID-19 is a recognized hazard. So that'll be likely what they fall back on, is that general duty provision. And then so they'll point to certain data as evidence. So just as an example, the Officer Down Memorial page is one of the areas that they keep track of active duty police officer deaths from anything. Could be a car accident, could be a gunshot wound, and they have a lot of different categories. COVID is one of those. And so this year they have that number at 460 police officers who contracted COVID on the job and died from it. So they'll point to data like that. They'll say this is a workplace safety issue in terms of their justification. They'll also point to stats coming out of places like universities that have mandates already in place. And there's about here in Michigan, it's about 11-fold decrease. So let's say a year ago, the first week in October, there were 4,902 newer ongoing cases of COVID-19 connected to outbreaks in Michigan. Today, there's 445. So they'll point to things like that. They'll say, number one, it is a hazard, and here's evidence. And then they'll say a vaccine mandate would reduce that hazard, and here's the evidence for that. So that's, I think that it's pretty predictable the case the government will make on that. On the other side of things, one of the justifications for a vaccine mandate is not everybody can receive a vaccine. And so I'm going to share my screen here because there was a really interesting set of data or a couple of sets of data that came out of first here in the Seattle area. They have these red lines by age, these age categories: less than 5 years old, 5 to 11, 12 to 15 years old. So you got all these age breakdowns. And in red are hospitalizations. These are not fatalities or deaths, these are hospitalizations. Hospitalizations of those not fully vaccinated, and then hospitalizations of vaccinated. So this light peach are the vaccinated individuals. So the adults, as you can see, the kids are about as safe as, say, a vaccinated 50-year-old. So that's one kind of data set, if you will. But what I think is a little bit more insight is the same data from England. So in England, they have it categorized by in about 10-year increments. And in the US, we do like 65 and up, and because of Medicare, it's really frustrating with the US. We have these traditional ages that separate out categories, and but if you look at it by decade, I think it's a little more insightful. So you can see kids under 18, that the data set is a little bit different, but they do hospitalizations per 100,000 people. And so if you're under 18, you'll see that it's about the same as a 40 to 49-year-old or a 50 to 59-year-old who is fully vaccinated. So these, I think, will be the types that'll be one of the pushback points, is to say, well, that kids are as safe even without a vaccine, about as safe as adults, or many adults. When I look at that, I can't help but think of like my own family. I'm 44. I have one of my kids is too young to get a vaccine. She's 11, and so according to that data, her and I'm fully vaccinated. She is not. We have about the same type of risk level of a hospitalization connected to COVID-19. And then I think the final thing that will be kind of not the final thing, but a major part of pushing back against the federal government will be the fact that if you take kids, you can take kids and say, well, kids are as safe as vaccinated adults. So that's one kind of argument that you can see how it's going to line up. Then say, how about adults? And with adults, anybody who wants a vaccine can get a vaccine, and therefore it's no longer a workplace safety issue. It becomes a personal health care management choice. And so how these things come head to head in court, I think to some extent it's anybody's guess, because these types of questions have not been asked at this level with these types of facts. But knowing what we know about our current Supreme Court, I would not be surprised, even a little, if they were to say that the federal government on the private sector mandate, not the federal employee mandate, but on the private sector mandate, I would not be surprised if eventually the United States Supreme Court were to say that the federal government has overstepped its bounds by issuing this as an emergency temporary standard and then an eventual OSHA rule. And when anybody who can get a vaccine, wants a vaccine, can get one for free. So that's the case as it stacks up today. I think we'll know within a relatively short period of time how aggressive the federal government plans to be with it. And you can be sure that we are going to follow this very, very closely all the way through.
So just on that final point about, now it's readily available, adults can have access to the vaccine. Here's another headline. Residents of Michigan's lowest vaccinated counties are twice as likely to die from COVID as those in Michigan's most vaccinated counties. And so here's the data: 16.9 deaths per 100,000 in the lowest vaccinated, 8.2 per 100,000 in the most vaccinated. And I thought it might be worthwhile to just name those counties. So here's the 10 least vaccinated counties in the state of Michigan: Hillsdale, Montcalm, Branch, Cass, Osceola, Oscoda, St. Joseph, Sanilac, Newaygo, and Gratiot are the 10 least vaccinated counties. And here are the 10 most vaccinated counties: Oakland, Washtenaw, Grand Traverse, Marquette, Leelanau, Mackinac, Emmett, Chippewa, Ontonagon, and Menominee, most vaccinated counties. So it just, it's what we've been talking about all along. Now it's a private choice. And so again, the idea that vaccinations really matter, it's a personal choice. People can choose to do it or not to do it, and whether or not it's the employer's responsibility or the person's responsibility is what this argument in some ways will come back down to. So
yeah, so I mean, and just to put a finer point on that, Rob, this really is what they're saying is that an employer may not employ a person, but for a given set of circumstances.
Yeah.
And that I think is going to be that they're going to have a hard time coming up with the legal justification on the private sector mandate to point to somewhere in statute where they have that level of authority at a time when vaccines are not limited in terms of in terms of people affording it, or access and distribution. The other thing kind of interesting about that list is that it includes very, very rural places on both ends of it.
Yeah,
so the
right.
vaccinated, the least vaccinated. So Ontonagon, which is practically in Minnesota, is you're not going to find much more rural than that. And that's on the same list as Washtenaw County, and Oakland County, which have high rates as well. So pretty interesting, and maybe busting up the stereotypes a little bit.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Hey, let's move on. Again, maybe we're going to get to some things that are not so much COVID related, but one more. Some people may actually be surprised to know that the Canadian and the Mexican border are actually closed to tourism, and that's about to change because finally both Canada and Mexico and the United States government had come to some agreement about how to deal with COVID for tourism in particular.
Finally, we see a date that has been set for November 8th, when you'll be able to travel to or tourism from Canada and Mexico will be able to come to the United States. And they'll have to prove vaccination status, one of the requirements, but they'll be able to come for non-essential purposes. And it has been a very long time since that has been the case. It's been pretty rough on some of those border communities that rely on Canadian tourism in terms of their local offerings and the traffic and their reason for existence. So this is a pretty big deal for certain communities in our state, but it's also important for relations between the United States and Canada, and in Mexico for that matter, but I'm focusing on Canada because that's our border here in Michigan, that for all of these months when the Canadians would let the US citizens go to Canada for non-essential purposes, but we would not reciprocate, that was causing some tensions between the two countries that are normally very close on almost everything. So it's a big development, it's an important development for places like Detroit and St. Clair County and up in the Sioux. So I think that it's a good step toward just a little bit more normalcy compared to pre-COVID times.
Let's move to some issues that are not really COVID related, but the kinds of issues that we normally will pay attention to and be tracking. One of them is what is called Line 5. Line 5 is the pipeline that runs through the Mackinac Straits, lays on the bottom of the straits. There's a plan in place to bury it under the straits in the bedrock to make it safe and secure. That's being fought really tooth and nail in some ways by the administration in Michigan and some others. What's the latest on that?
So this has been the state of Michigan versus Enbridge for most of this time period, but there was a big change that happened a couple of weeks ago, and that is the country, Canada, started getting involved and have cited a treaty between the United States and Canada that suggests that this needs to be worked out at that level. You can't just have a state governor or an attorney general take property, an easement that is owned by a company, in this case, Enbridge. Now, the part that is has always been ironic is that even though there's not an indication that there's any problem with the pipeline as it exists today, there are certain risks of having it on the bed of Lake Michigan, and you could make those risks literally zero if you put it in a dry tunnel, 100 feet in bedrock below the lake bed. And so the idea is you could always physically see it, even if it's somehow in a tunnel 100 feet into bedrock below the straits. Even if there was a leak, it couldn't get to the water. It's just the idea that it's, but there wouldn't be, because what's going to be able to touch it there. So anyway, you got this plan which removes all the risks without interrupting the propane service into the UP and the oil refineries that everybody in the Midwest relies on, and also plastics, which are heavily used in manufacturing, which they need this pipeline as well. So there's a lot of reasons to say, hey, this is great. We can have the pipeline and a dry bed tunnel and bedrock, remove literally 100% of the risk from it ever impacting the Great Lakes, and it's been fought really tooth and nail, and without good explanation. So finally, now it's reached a stage where the country, Canada, as you might imagine, just like the U.S. would, if some premier, which is what they call governors in Canada, if some premier were to say, hey, property owned by an American company in Canada, we're just going to take it, and so you might imagine like that would cause a stir, and the U.S. would probably invoke the same treaty that exists. So this really does, in a lot of ways, it takes it out of the hands of state government and puts it into the hands of the feds. And my guess is before that gets worked out, the pipeline is going to be in the tunnel.
Yeah. All right. Here's another one. There's an administrative rule coming out of the Michigan court system. I think really for the purpose of protecting personal information, but it's going to have an impact on small businesses. And here's the connection. It basically is saying all personal information has to be redacted in a court hearing, so that you wouldn't be able to tell, somebody's social security number. Obviously, you wouldn't want that to be out. But date of birth is one of those things, and date of birth is really the thing used by most companies who do background checks. And so it really would hamper the ability for private companies to do background checks if the court is to go ahead and go forward with this administrative rule.
If you have a common name, this court administrative rule is going to cause you problems when you go into new employment, to the extent that you're going to a place that does background checks, and many professions do them. Some professions are required to do them. So the court will be redacting the birth date in particular, which is really important to figure out whether the John Smith that is applying for the job is the same as the John Smith in the court hearing, and so this will make background checks much less reliable. It will make them more costly, and in some cases they might not be realistic, depending on how common the name is. So there is some action at the legislative level to try and to deal with this, to change this standard before it would take effect, which would be in January 1st of next year. And so I think there'll be a negotiation that happens, and maybe some progress on it. But there are certain professions where this is more important than others, and I do expect those professions are going to be very active in trying to figure out a way. Well, if not this, then how? Yeah. How do we ensure that if the laws in the state of Michigan say I may not hire somebody who has this type of felony conviction to do this type of job, how then am I to make sure that somebody with a common name doesn't have a conviction if we can't at least match up the birth dates?
Yeah. So it's a good example. We're actually in kind of a period of time where it's been left open to hear from organizations who would be affected by it. It was originally scheduled to go into effect July 1. It's been sort of put on a little bit of hold so they could hear the arguments. And it's a good example of a place where our advocacy and the advocacy of those who represent small business or serve small businesses, in this case, the background checking industry, really have an opportunity to have their voices heard on this issue.
Yeah, and the nice thing about it is that there are a lot of criminal justice reform and privacy laws and proposals that we've been involved in the past. So in this case, what we really want to do is to make sure that businesses that want to, or in some cases are required to know whether somebody has a record, don't put those businesses in a position where they literally cannot comply with the rules that the government has at some point in the past placed on them.
All right. Hey, we're going to talk about one more issue. Let's push it to Thursday. It's the Redistricting Commission. They've drawn some initial maps and are getting some crazy pushback on them. Maybe you'll have a chance to go a little deeper into that on Thursday. Actually, I won't be with you on Thursday. I'll be in Grand Rapids at a meeting, but I also want to just mention, for those of you who have been paying attention to our the new offering, the new member benefit called a pooled employer plan, which is a 401k where you can put your volume with other small businesses and get a better deal. That pooled employer plan, we're doing a webinar on Wednesday, the 20th at 11:30. If you want to find out more about that, go to our website at sbam.org. That's all we have for you today. Brian will be here on Thursday, and I'll see you back next Monday.
See you on Thursday, everybody.